After the good feedback on my pilot episode, here is the next one. In this video series I go bit by bit through Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies in the extended edition and try to explain every lore detail and every reference, also some book differences and some behind the scenes elements. We are of course still at the Fellowship of the Rings, and today and also next episode the Hobbits and the Shire will be the main topics. This is actually a quite unusual episode and will be a bit shorter this time because of my E3 coverage. Also feel free to check the first episode about the prologue. As always, it helps if you have at least seen the movies. This also means spoiler warning for all the films and books. There could be some mistakes, feel free to hint at them in the comment section. The films had no access to some of Tolkien's books I will use here because of licensing issues. And I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it. That means a lot of rolled R's, except for some exceptions. Let's start where we stopped. We see the map of Middle-earth and hear Bilbo saying something about the 22nd day of September by Shire-reckoning. We come to this in a moment while he works on his book, which is called, or let's say its first part is called, The Hobbit or There and Back Again, or as in the movies, There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale, telling the story of Bilbo's adventures with the dwarves, the dragon and how he found his ring. He also later added a lot of elven lore information, which he partially researched in Rivendell during his retirement, where he also completed his part of the book. The book will be known as the Red Book of Westmarch, which he gave to Frodo in Rivendell, as seen in the movies, and who also later wrote his story, pretty much the Lord of the Rings, into it. In addition, Peregrine Took and Meriadoc Brandybuck added more information to it, so it covered the legendarium of Middle-earth, so to say Tolkien's universe, pretty well. This book, or copies of it to be precise, became an important source of the events of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings for the Fourth Age. Tolkien's real-world inspiration was most likely the Red Book of Hergest. It's quite interesting that his books appear in his story, giving it a strange kind of authenticity. The Hobbit was Tolkien's first book of the series, published in 1937. The original was not tied to the Lord of the Rings universe when it first released, but he later changed parts of The Hobbit in its second and following editions so it would fit into Lord of the Rings. The second edition was published in the early 50s, a bit before Lord of the Rings was released. A reason for this was that the publisher wanted a sequel and Tolkien worked on his universe in form of the Silmarillion for a very long time. So why not fuse it together, making The Hobbit a link between Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. This topic is quite complex and maybe I dedicate a separate video to the creation of his universe and Tolkien's writing at some point in the future. As mentioned, Bilbo talks about the date, which is in Shire-reckoning. Usually we see dates with a numbered age and a year number. In addition, the ages themselves are also tied to a time span of cosmic order, so to say, and the number of the ages is tied to important events. Lord of the Rings takes place at the end of the Third Age, of the years of the Sun. Frodo's adventure starts Third Age 3018. The years of the Sun is the cosmic time span and started after Sun and Moon were created. Before that were the years of the trees and before those there were the years of the lamps. I made a video about the trees if you are interested. The lamps are also slightly mentioned in it. When it comes to the three ages, the Third Age started with the defeat of Sauron through the last alliance of elves and men, as explained in the previous episode. The Second Age started with the defeat of Sauron's master Morgoth in the War of Wrath. And the First Age of the Years of the Sun started with the awakening of men. However, there is a bit of confusion about the First Age. For me, the First Age means the First Age of the Years of the Sun. Some count parts of the years of the trees also towards the First Age, for example, starting with the Elves' Awakening or the creation of the two trees of Valinor, which I don't do because there is no consensus, but when I say First Age of the Years of the Sun or Years of the Trees 1495, it becomes clear what I mean. The date topic is quite complicated, especially considering that before the Years of the Sun in Tolkien's mythology, the Sun did not exist, and so 1 year was much longer compared to a solar year. So 1 year of the Years of the Trees must be multiplied with about 9.582 to get the number of years in solar years. However, Bilbo's 111th birthday, which is the 22nd of September, third age of the years of the sun, 3001, is in Shire-reckoning year 1401. You can simply subtract 1600 from the third age date. Year 1 is set to the colonization of the Shire, third age 1601. In the film, Bilbo mentions 22nd September 1400, which is 1 year earlier than described in the books. The 22nd of September 1401 in Shire-reckoning is also Frodo's 33rd birthday, which gets lost in the movies. There Frodo also looks younger than 33. So Frodo's and Bilbo's birthday are at the same day. Fun fact, time spans are far longer in the books. Frodo leaves Rivendell with the Fellowship when he is 50 years old, so a lot of time passes in the books before Gandalf finds out what is going on with Bilbo's ring and Frodo leaving the Shire. But back to the film. Bilbo continues writing a chapter name concerning hobbits. Even though he writes, so to say, the Hobbit book in his Red Book, concerning hobbits is in fact the prologue chapter for Lord of the Rings. It explains hobbits, their culture, the events of the Hobbit, and how it's connected to the Red Book originally written by Bilbo. So it's a nice reference in the films and explains the creation of the mentioned Red Book, which appears a few times in the films and is of course also present in the books. What is strange is that he places a full stop, which misses later in Rivendell when Bilbo shows Frodo his book. As seen before, we also see Bilbo write by Bilbo Baggins. This is actually a good opportunity to talk about names. This could become a bit linguistic, but in my opinion it's worth understanding. What will be quite surprising for some people is that Bilbo Baggins is actually not his real name, so to say. It is Bilba Labingi. Tolkien loved languages and he was also a professor for philology. A fascinating part of the Lord of the Rings universe is the linguistic detail in it. We have multiple languages for all peoples, be it elves, dwarves or men. Also, we have language development over centuries, so languages develop in other languages over time, and with this, new languages are created and sometimes even coexist, which reflects reality quite well. The Elvish languages Quenya and Sindarin are maybe good examples. Tolkien put a ridiculous amount of detail into them in the background. When you have different languages in your world and want to tell a story, you always have the problem, how do you portray and translate this? Tolkien decided to represent the common speech, also called Westron, with modern English. So whenever somebody speaks Westron in Lord of the Rings, you read or hear modern English. So I guess he wanted to present his story as if he has found the Red Book and translated it into English, like a translator. For this, he even anglicized some names with special origin, like Frodo Baggins, whose actual name is Maura Labingi. Hobbits spoke Westron, but had some own Hobbitish words and especially names, so Frodo's real name, Maura, is not Westron. Westron itself in Tolkien's universe is derived from Adunaic, the language of the Dunedain from Númenor, which is related to the Old Mannish tongue from the north, because Nordmen and Dunedain, the Westmen, were all Edain, which means men, and spoke the same language. The Edain were a specific group of men, which is complicated, so a topic for a future video about the origins of men. What is important now, all languages of the Edain are related. Now, how did Tolkien come up with those translations of the Hobbit names? Frod in Old English means something like wise, experienced. Maur in a fictive Old Mannish language from the north in Tolkien's universe also means wise, experienced. And that is why Maura is translated with Frodo. This amount of detail is always mind-blowing for me. What does Northern Old Mannish mean? The word Maur appears in Rohirrig, the language of Rohan, which is basically Old English, but you could say partially with some other words mixed in from other existing real-world languages or words invented by Tolkien, like, for example, Maur. So we even have a connection here to Old English itself and Northern Old Mannish in the books. But there is more. Why do hobbits use Old Mannish names and words from the north? Hobbits are counted towards men, and guess where they are originally from? Exactly, the north, close to Mirkwood and the river Anduin, which is also close to the area where Rohan's ancestors, the Eotheod, lived. And this is an explanation how the name Maura came to the Shire, so it goes full circle. To summarize this, so in Westron, represented by modern English, Frodo would be the experience, but his true name is not Westron, and instead from an old and related version of Westron from the Norse, also spoken by Rohan's ancestors, so it's represented by an old and related version of modern English, which is Old English or Anglo-Saxon. Not only does this detail make sense, it is also represented by the history of the peoples in Middle-earth and their movement over the centuries, and this is just one example, there are more. And so it also makes sense that Rohan's language is almost like Old English itself, with some changes and different words, because it must be related to Westron over Adunaic too. And also there is a detail that very old names from Rohan's ancestors, who all came from the East ones, are actually Gothic. And Gothic is an East Germanic language, while Old English is a newer West Germanic language, but of course they are still related. So to say, the language relation in the books are represented by the real-world counterparts too. You can easily get lost in this amount of detail. Of course, this is not and can't be represented in the movies to this detail, but it would be amazing if Bilbo signed the book with Bilba Labingi, even though only few people would actually understand this reference. If you wonder where some of the Hobbit names are explained, you can find it in the History of Middle-earth book Peoples of Middle-earth. In addition, the films had no access to those books, which must be considered too. Back to the film. Bilbo says back end, backshot row, Hobbiton, West Farthing. It's actually backshot row 1 to be precise. This is Bilbo's address. Back end is his mansion, which was very big for only Bilbo and Frodo, indicating their higher social status. The backshot row was a row or street where back-end lies. Several people live in backshot row, like the Gumchees, living backshot row 3. This guy is Everard Proudfoot, who was invented for the films, but is most likely based on the book's character Odo Proudfoot, who lives backshot row 5. And a hobbit named Fredegar Bolger, also called Fatty, lived in backshot row 10. We see him mentioned in the film when Bilbo shakes his hand during his birthday party. In the books, he plays a more important role because there Frodo and his friends hide in the Shire for some time and Fatty pretends to be Frodo, while they actually left already, drawing the attention away from the ring bearer. As mentioned, the beginning part in the Shire is far longer and different in the books. Hobbiton is a village in the center of the Shire, where Backend lies. The Shire itself is divided in 4 or later 5 and 6 divisions. 4 of those are called Farthings, and Hobbiton is part of West Farthing. The 5th is Buckland, but of course it can be debated if it's part of the Shire. However, originally there were only the 4 Farthings. Bilbo continues introducing the Hobbit culture, explaining that they ignore the business of the big folk. The hobbits, when they settled in the Shire, were always a bit isolated, but had loose contact to men and elves. In addition, Tolkien describes that they possess the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, which seemed almost magical to men. Interestingly, the early hobbits were allowed to settle in the Shire by the king of Fornost, which is the capital of the Arthedain kingdom, one of the 3 kingdoms Arnor split into. Aragorn is related to this line of kings. The king who allowed them to settle in the Shire, which was once his unpopulated hunting ground, must have been Argileb II, one of Aragorn's ancestors. The only condition was that they were still under his rule and that they must maintain and repair some important bridges, which they did. However, the Shire was so isolated that they never had that much contact to the outside world, especially after Arthedain was destroyed and vanished. This isolation gives the Shire its special character, but there was a purpose of Tolkien behind it. You can see the Shire as an anachronism, a stylistic device where something feels out of the chronological plausibility or the timeline of the world, while Middle-earth is in most parts quite medieval, or even in parts of the late antiquity. The Shire is much further. They have a mayor, a mail service, mechanical clocks, umbrellas. Even their clothing with their waistcoat buttons does not fit in this time. In one of Tolkien's illustrations of Back-End, we even see a barometer on the wall. All this is more the English countryside of the Victorian era than the Middle Ages. And indeed, it's most likely inspired by the English county Worcestershire, around where Tolkien lived as a child. He He was also born 1892 at the end of the Victorian era, so it makes sense how he describes the Shire. Of course, it's an idealized view of it. However, I see this stylistic device to be the entrance for the reader, and back in the day he was most likely from England. So he could identify with this place and start the journey through Middle-earth from somewhere familiar. The idea of home and a place dear to your heart is important for the story of Lord of the Rings and also The Hobbit. And even though this childhood memory of Tolkien from over 120 years ago should seem quite distant for us today, it still works impressively well, even for me, who grew up and lived all his life in cities. Who does not want to visit the Shire? Another element we find in Lord of the Rings from Tolkien's life is smoking the pipe, and it would not be Tolkien if there is not a bit of backstory to that too. Sadly, that story must wait until next episode. Thank you for watching. I feel a bit bad for ending the episode here, but E3 is coming and I try to make a short guesstimating before the first E3 press conference starts, so a busy week and a shorter episode. Hobbit and Shire lore is not my expertise, so research was quite extensive for this and next episode, but still very insightful and interesting. I hope you still liked this short and a bit messy episode. Let me know in the comments. Also, in case you liked the video, consider using the like button. This video was probably a bit too linguistic, I feel, but it felt like a good opportunity too. Maybe I'll make a video about the languages in Tolkien's universe at some point, but that's a highly complex topic. We did also not make much progress in terms of minutes into the films this time, but the early Shire part in Fellowship of the Rings is more complex than you might think. So, next is E3 coverage. I will definitely complete the Shire and Bilbo's birthday part in the next episode, so yes, this format will take quite some time. Gaming wise, interesting months are also on the horizon for me. I'm interested in Soul Calibur 6, which I predict to come around August, but also Monster Hunter and some other games. If they are interesting enough, expect coverage in some form. Also, the Círdan lore video is still on my mind, but I can't say when it will come. My time estimation and management skills are awful. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.